Thank you so much for having me and inviting me. I'd like to thank all the organizers and for the opportunity to participate virtually, since I cannot be there in person. So I'm going to be speaking on Islamophobia and the security industrial complex by examining the experiences of the 9/11 generation of Muslim youth. So this is based on my book, Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. And as I heard my bio read out earlier, I realized that what I have online is quite outdated and I needed to update it since this book has been out since April of this year. And it examines through an ethnographic exploration how the 9/11 generation of Canadian Muslim youth navigate Islamophobia during times of war and terror. You know, I'm often asked why I chose to do this research. And in the book's preface, I talk about three drivers that motivated this study. And the first one had to do with the experiences of my sons who were growing up as part of this millennial 9/11 generation. And I was, seeing how growing up under this era of this global war on terror and domestic security policies and Islamophobic backlash was impacting them. So for example, my older son is named Osama. He was about 13 when 9/11 happened, and that was not an easy name to have after 9/11. So he was subject to a lot of harassment as a result of it. My younger son was an actor growing up, and since the age of 13, he's been auditioning for different roles and all of a sudden started being asked to read for the role of terrorist number 2. So we noticed that happening, among other things. And as I saw my sons grow up and, through their schooling experiences in university and so on, I couldn't help but compare this with my own experience as a Muslim student back in the late 80s and 90s as an undergrad, and how some of the events that we held as part of our Muslim Student Association back then would have set us up for surveillance by Canada's security agencies if we tried to do them in the current climate. I give some examples of that, particularly of a fundraiser that we did for an organization that later became on Canada's terror watch list. But at that time, they were doing a lot of humanitarian work in Afghanistan. So we held a big fundraiser and we did it in a Catholic school gym. And because a lot of people were coming, we actually got some Afghan Mujahideen brothers who were in the community getting physical rehab because of their, having been in the war and having had a lot of injuries because of landmines and so on. And so we asked them to come and be the security. And so they were circling this Catholic school gym dressed in, tunics and long beards and turbans with walkie-talkies. And, thinking about that in this current context, we would have had all of the security agencies converging on that site. So that was another sort of driver or reflection that I had. And then the third thing, some sort of catalyst for this research, was seeing one of my students, undergraduate students, wanting to join a nonviolent reactionary Islamist group because they were using Islamophobia as a call for followers. To adhere to their narrow worldview and a call to a return to a caliphate system. And so I was really interested in what would motivate someone who was otherwise very much a champion of social justice issues and, quite active on campus, doing a lot of positive and progressive work to, be motivated to go down this different path. And so those are the drivers that motivated me to embark on this study and examine the experience of the millennial generation of Muslim youth who were coming of age during a time where the global war on terror was taking place, where there were domestic security policies that were targeting them as potential radicals and jihadists, and their faith and identity was rendering them suspect. So just a bit about the study. It was an ethnographic study that I did that focused on interviews with 130 youth workers, and religious and community leaders who self-identified as Muslim from 23 ethno-racial groups. And the interviews span coast to coast from New Brunswick, Ontario, Quebec, and BC. And that fieldwork took place over about 6 years from 2009 to 2016. So in the book, just isolating 3 sort of key themes that run through it. And one of them has to do with the affective registers of Islamophobia and how it's lived and experienced by the 9/11 generation and how it created these post 9/11 identities. And then I focus on Islamophobia and the security industrial complex, which is what I'll speak about today. And I do that in 2 chapters. I'm only going to be able to share a little bit from one of those chapters, which is looking at the racial securitization that Muslim youth experience. But the chapter following it looks at the idea of radicalization and how Muslim youth consider that, since they are often labeled under that. And so that's another area that looks at the impact of securitization on these youth. And finally, I end the book talking about Muslim counterpublics and looking at youth activism and resistance through the arts, because I really wanted to not end this book with an understanding that what Muslim youth were experiencing rendered them simply as victims, but I wanted them to be understood as agents who are actively resisting the multiple forms of oppression that they do confront. And so I always find the arts as a very powerful means of political resistance, and resonates with people in deeper ways than a lot more traditional forms of resistance. So that's where the book ends. But I'm only able to talk today about the issue of Islamophobia and racial securitization through the security industrial complex. And I'll just touch on 4 sort of themes that run through that chapter and provide some of the narratives of my participants that exemplify these themes. So first, talking about the idea of folk devils and moral panics. So socially deviant archetypes of Muslims, what we often see in the media, correspond to what Stanley Cohen referred to as the creation of the folk devil. And folk devils become scapegoats and are blamed for a variety of social problems. So in the post 9/11 context, those archetypes of radical terrorists have relied on Orientalist tropes to construct stereotypes of the dangerous Muslim folk devil that have served to legitimate imperial military campaigns and domestic security measures, and played a key archetypal role in post 9/11 security discourses, policies, and practices as an emblem of deviance and risk. So media sensationalism, salacious clickbait, conspiracy theories are among those drivers that lead to the creation of moral panics about Islam and Muslims in the public imaginary. And all of that, of course, creates a kind of groundwork for situating the study and the work looking at Muslim youth narratives around being part of this 9/11 generation who didn't know much of the world prior and were being socialized into these new conditions. I also drew on the work of Biget's panopticon, and in theorizing the notion of the panopticon, Biget extends the Foucauldian perception of a panoptic society and its modalities of surveillance to offer a wider lens for how control and surveillance of minority groups takes place at a distance. So the diverse network of surveillance technologies that include information and virtual reality are deployed in what he describes as, quote, the governmentality of unease in a field of global insecurity. And so he argues that through interconnected bureaucracies, surveillance governmentalities integrate diverse institutional agents such as, quote, customs, police, intelligence service, bankers engaged in risk assessment, and suppliers of new technologies of surveillance engaged in this management of fear. So this is just echoing what my colleagues on the panel have previously presented. And so security actors and agencies create and manage risk by, quote, specifying specific threats or risks that can be managed together. Immigration to regulate, an environment to protect, terrorism to fight, and in the end, a population worried by the encircling barbarians and the idea of the decline of civilization. And I think that speaks very well to contemporary forms and manifestations of Islamophobia. And moving from that and drawing upon it, it also creates something that I've called a securitized habitus. And so I'm drawing on the notions of Pierre Bourdieu, and Bourdieu describes the notion of habitus as being enacted in the way that the social order is progressively inscribed in people's minds. So it's how individuals perceive and react to the social worlds they inhabit. So I contend that the post 9/11 condition in the West created a specific securitized habitus. Muslims and society at large have become conditioned into this fraught environment and the ideologies and practices that are produced by it. These dynamics are internalized and in turn produce specific behaviors, affective responses, and shared experiences of alienation. And so for Muslims, this vigilance manifests in making conscious or unconscious decisions to, for example, modify one's clothing, one's bodily comportment and behavior, smiling more so as not to be seen as threatening, or checking what you might be carrying with you when you're traveling that could be deemed suspicious. And all of these conditions then create another psychosocial impact, which is this internalized Islamophobia and the what I call the panopticon of self-surveillance. So the surveillance that Muslims have endured since 9/11 has resulted in a kind of panopticon effect where people become self-surveilling subjects, avoiding suspicion by second-guessing and curtailing otherwise innocent actions for fear that they may be read as subversive. So I refer to the way that Muslim youth navigate the realities of the post 9/11 context as this panopticon of self-surveillance, where they internalize the regulatory gaze that they are subject to, and hence become self-policing subjects. And so I now want to share with you some of the narratives of my participants to exemplify these themes. So of course, we've heard of this idea of flying while Muslim, and a number of my participants spoke about this phenomenon. So in this focus group, Tariq says, I was at an airport and I was going to Friday prayers. I was wearing an Arabic dress, thobe, and I was just dropping off my dad in the lobby, and two security agents came up to me and started questioning me. I wasn't even going on a flight. And then Zubaydah comments, I think the main time and place where I feel and where I most sense my Muslim identity post 9/11 is at the border at the airport. So when you're at the airport, there are supposed to be random checks, but it's almost never random if you're wearing a hijab. And then Mahmoud comments, are you the kind we want, or are you the kind we don't want? They're trying to corner people. People don't want to lie, but if they're going to go if they want to go inside the country, if an immigration officer is asking me, do you pray 5 times a day? And if you say yes or no, this might just change your whole application. So these youth were very aware of flying while Muslim and being Muslim while crossing borders, and the kind of surveillance that was leveled upon them, and the kinds of judgments that were made that have, as we know, a long history in Islamophobic and Orientalist tropes. In other examples, Mehdi speaks about his experience as a student, and he said, so I go through American borders a lot. Usually when they see my last name, Mohammed, and they see I'm born in the Middle East and my passport has an Iranian visa. So most of the time they don't stop me, but they do ask, what are you studying? What are you doing? And I'm kind of afraid to answer chemistry or science because, you know, I'm afraid to say that I'm a chemist because they may think that I might be making a bomb or something. And so we know that there was a lot of scrutiny on particularly, international students coming to Canada and other places who wanted to study certain sciences or chemistry or things like of that nature that might render them suspect as potential bomb makers. And so these students were quite aware of that. And Zubaydah also comments about her experiences and says that I would never say Allahu Akbar at the airport when there are people around. I'd be too scared to say that. You know, being judged and just scaring other people. But like Mehdi said, he's scared to say that he's a chemist or whatever. And, you know, if somebody else is a pilot, they would be scared to mention it. I know a family that whenever they are crossing the border or they're flying to the United States or coming back, they always shave their beards. Even if you're not under surveillance, you feel that you have to hide these things because people are going to judge you. So those are some of the examples of how that regulatory gaze of suspicion and scrutiny is internalized by Muslim youth. This example I always find especially poignant. Zbeda talks about the fact that we were going to the US and my baby cousin was on the airplane and he had a book written for children about how to fly an airplane. And we were all so scared. We were like, why did we pack this? You know, everyone was so scared because you feel this this way, like you're always on the lookout. Are we going to get judged? I should probably sit nicely, smile more. People shouldn't be scared of me. So this sort of self-surveillance, also on something so innocent as just a children's book coming on an airplane, you know, is something that for Zbeda and her family, you know, sparked that sense of self-regulation and what have we got with us that makes us it might make us be read as suspicious. And, you know, when we think of the, you know, the toddlers that were on the no-fly list, the Passenger Protect program, then, you know, these concerns are not unwarranted. This quote here also expanding on this notion that I think that when there isn't surveillance, we feel there is and we're scared, we're on edge. So even if people aren't watching us, we feel that we do need to be on the lookout and we have to be on our best behavior. And so, you know, not being wanted to be categorized as the bad Muslim, the suspect Muslim, Muslim youth are often mindful of making sure that they are on their best behavior when they're out in public so that, you know, they are not categorized in that way. So it's, you know, this good Muslim, bad Muslim divide that has been reinscribed during the War on Terror. And so a lot of these concerns are not unfounded. This isn't just a sort of paranoia that these youth have developed. It's actually rooted in a lot of, you know, actual forms of surveillance that they are subject to. And, you know, earlier on, the RCMP talked about the jihadization of Muslim youth as being the greatest threat to global security. And of course, those ideas then underwrite and reference a lot of the policies and practices that become enacted by national security agencies. And so, you know, MSA presidents and executive members have been approached by CSIS, RCMP, and counterterrorism units of local police in various jurisdictions. Specific MSA groups have been under surveillance by security agencies. Recording device was discovered in the prayer room at the Metropolitan Toronto University, formerly Ryerson. And, you know, Muslim youth are also being recruited by CSIS and RCMP. They have this projects of winning the hearts and minds and also recruiting Muslim youth into their ranks to you know, continue this securitization. You know, when I talk about these examples, I'm also reminded of my son when he was elected as president of the Muslim Student Association at his university. And the elections happened at night. They didn't really have time to let the membership know who was elected as president. But the very next morning at like 9 a.m., my son received a phone call on his cell phone from CSIS, who wanted to talk to him because he was elected as the MSA president, and they requested a meeting to talk about national security. And, you know, so that really hit home. The MSA at my university have been also subject to surveillance or, well, you know, fact-finding missions by security agencies, in particular a local counterterrorism unit who wanted to meet with the president and vice president of the MSA. And I sat in on that meeting. So, you know, I didn't want these students to go on their own to be, you know, part of these fact-finding missions. And so there have been many instances where I've been called upon to sort of intervene in these cases where Muslim student associations are being surveilled. So it is not a, you know, a kind of paranoia. It's very much referenced in the realities that these youth are facing. And so this security industrial complex and Muslim student associations have led to this sort of securitized habitus that I spoke about earlier. And in this exchange, Rania says there's a designated counter-terrorist agent for the community, and they want to work with and have a good relationship with MSAs in our campus, on every campus. I asked if this was only for Muslims, and he said, Fortunately, it is. And this targeting happens everywhere. In our universities, we've had experiences with political movements, nothing huge, just suspicion. Securitization is a problem, but like, how do we figure out what's acceptable and not? It's so difficult and it's disturbing. And so as these youth were experiencing these forms of surveillance, they also struggled to gain the political literacy that they needed to know, how do we engage? Can we say no to these requests for meetings? What are the policies and practices? What are our rights? And so that was something that the 9/11 generation had to really get up to speed on. And then Yusuf says, it's not just how other people are going to see us, but how we see ourselves, like how we internalize it. Even when we were planning the MSA retreat, we wanted to go to a forest and build a bonfire. But then we had to start thinking about that. And it's even kind of funny. We were joking that if somebody saw all of us visibly Muslim folks showing up there, all kinds of suspicion would arise. So we internalize that fear. We have to monitor what we do so it doesn't come off as suspicious, even if it's not. And so, this was a dynamic that I saw again and again in the interviews that I did. I would ask Muslim youth the question about, how did 9/11 affect you? And of course, many were quite young, just in elementary schools, and they were there watching the Twin Towers fall on TV on that day. They didn't know much of a world before, so they were being socialized into this new normal. And when I would ask them how 9/11 affected them, they would often say it didn't affect them. But then I would probe further and ask other questions like, okay, what are your student groups doing? And they would say, well, we wanted to go up north and play paintball, but we didn't want to be seen as a terrorist boot camp. So we didn't do that. And they would say things like, well, sometimes we play violent video games like Call of Duty, but we won't do that in a public space on the university campus, like never in the concourse, because we don't want people to think that we are sort of plotting a terror attack by doing that. Okay, but then 9/11 didn't affect them, right? So that was something they kept saying, but it was quite obvious that it did affect and mediate their behaviors and actions. However, they just understood this as part of the reality they were in and didn't really connect it with the kind of shifts that had happened. So that's what I wanted to share with you in regards to some of the findings in my book in relation to the 9/11 generation. And I just wanted to leave also plugging my new report, which will be coming out next week on the Canadian Islamophobia industry, mapping Islamophobia's ecosystem in the Great White North. This was a 4-year project that looked at very detailed mapping of Islamophobia's ecosystem, the networks within it. And this was done in partnership with the Islamophobia Studies Center and the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the University of California, Berkeley. It's a very detailed, almost 300-page report where we have a separate archive of over 100 pages of references. And so I will make sure that this becomes available next week when it's released. And, in this report, unlike other studies on the Islamophobia industry that have so far only been done south of the border, in this study, we actually brought in some other players into this network that hadn't been captured in the American studies. So, for example, looking at the role of think tanks and their designated security experts, as well as white nationalists. And of course, there's around 300 white nationalist organizations, many of them have a very dominant Islamophobic anti-Muslim mandate. And so we've included those along with some of the other players that have their counterparts in the US, and tried to look a little bit at the bankrolling of this bigotry and how Islamophobia is an organized system of oppression. So thanks very much. I'll leave it here and look forward to any questions that you may have.